here, I can see, the great counter to any hatred. I wanted to say that last year, how many of you saw the Great Mystery Show exhibition? Oh, okay, good. Well, in that mystery, there were mysteries upon mysteries. And one of them was a section called The Mystery of the Human Heart. And only about 3 years ago, with all of the world's research onto the nature of the human heart and heart transplants and artificial hearts, only 3 years ago, in Queensland, Australia, did they discover something that had never been detected before. And that each of our human hearts have taste bud receptors inside of them, not for sweet, not for salty, only for bitterness. And so I thought, gosh, that's so poetic, I love that, you know. But why that's so important is that when we are full of anger, or when we're full of jealousy or rage or hatred, it changes the pH of our blood. And it becomes, all of our bodily fluids become slightly more acidic. And as they pass through the heart tastes that and clenches. So you've heard when people die of broken-hearted syndrome, grief is certainly more meritorious than hatred, but the burden of a negative emotion makes a great cost to that person. And so perfectly healthy people who had had great hearts, it's always been a mystery. Why are they passing away? You know, yes, they lost someone they love so much, but it's because when the heart tastes that bitterness, it absolutely clenches. So we had the chief of pediatric cardiology come by this museum, and she had long pondered why this could be that people with healthy hearts could die, and in their hearts, when they would do autopsy, there would be no blockage, but just the heart was very worn out in such a short time. Now, why is that apropos to today? The great Dr. Martin Luther King preached that hatred is a poison we ingest, hoping to hurt the other fellow. And so this is a healing, and intended as a healing exhibition on so many levels for people, because people who hate, and we just saw that, you know, the Coast Guard guy who was just, arrested. People who hate, it is a disease, and we're hoping that this exhibition will be poured out on people in such a loving and powerful way, as it has from when we first were privileged to show it. And then because of Helene and Art and Remembrance and her sister Elaine, it went to 42 other museums around the world. But it has come home mostly because so many of our visitors said, oh, when can we see that again? You know, they couldn't get enough of your mom's work. So we're very privileged to say that for the next 5 years, that's a big commitment, this exhibition of the 36 embroideries, so done, not for us to see them, only for her family to see how she had lived, you know? So it also gives us a starting point to share how happy families, you know, who, when you see Esther's life before the Nazis rode in on horseback, you know, and beat up her grandfather and cut his beard, how happy they were, you know, and it's the same kind of having pets, having your own holidays, whatever they be, the rhythm of happy family life, your favorite foods, your favorite jokes, how all over the world, and it's happening now, of course, in Rohingya, it's happening certainly in Yemen, where suddenly you're considered odd man out, and through no fault of your own, your family is put in deadly peril. So this is something that didn't just happen in the Holocaust, and certainly happened well before. And it's such a enormous privilege and responsibility to be able to share this with everyone for the next 5 years, and to have had Bernice, who's become my friend, be able to share this with you all for 5 years. Now, guess what she did? She has a daughter that was the first grandchild born to Esther. And that child has 2 daughters now. And both of those daughters are named after the 2 little sisters, Hannah and Leah, that were destroyed in the Holocaust, that were not old enough to go and get work and survive posing as Catholic farm girls. So, but best of all was Rachel's timing, and it's divine timing because she didn't try for this. Esther's birthday was February the 8th, and on February the 8th, little Hannah was born, which means grace in Hebrew. So on that, you've got just a long line of good womb here. I'm going to introduce Bernice Steinhardt, Esther's daughter.
I love Rebecca. As Rebecca said, my mother created her artwork not to express herself as an artist, not to have her work hanging on a wall somewhere. She did it really for me and my sister, because she wanted us to remember her family. She wanted us to know the people that she had lost, who she had loved, and she wanted to pass her memories of them onto her children and ultimately to her grandchildren. And my parents lived in Frederick, and while she was creating this work, and every week we would drive up, my family, my husband and my kids and I would drive up to Frederick to have dinner with them, and so I would see what she was working on. So I was witness to the process. And when she finished each of the pieces, she would have them stretched, and she would send them home with me. And I would hang them on my walls until eventually I ran out of walls. And but it was clear that they really needed to be seen by people outside of my friends and family, the people who would come to my house. And I'm really thrilled that some of those friends who knew my mother and came to my house are here tonight, or this afternoon rather, to see the exhibition again and in a very different setting. And when we decided that we really needed to get the art out into the world, we also realized that it was, while we felt so strongly that the beauty of the art and the power of the art needed to be shared, we also felt strongly that it was important to share the story and the art to not only educate people about what happened through the story of one young girl, but also to inspire them and to move them and to help them understand what it felt like to experience war and injustice and intolerance and anti-Semitism and that othering, that kind of discrimination that makes you, or that creates lesser people. And of course today we see that happening in the world around us. And so the mission of the organization that my sister and I created, Art and Remembrance, the mission of our organization has been focused on sharing our mother's story to inspire, to educate, to inform, and to create a dialogue, a discussion around what's happening in the world today and how it connects to my mother's story. So the panel we have with us, and we're so honored really to have these speakers, are people who in their own right have experienced and some of the phenomena that is happening in our world today. And so I'm very honored to introduce briefly Judy Tallwing, who is an artist and an activist in Baltimore working with Native communities, and is herself a member of the Apache Nation. Yay! And actually, one of Judy's paintings is in the exhibition. Is it two? Her pieces are in the exhibition with my mother Esther's work. So you'll see for yourself what an incredible artist she is. And then Mark Hetfield, who I feel privileged to call a friend as well. Mark is the president and CEO of HIAS, which originally stood for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the oldest refugee protection organization in the United States, in the world. And HIAS has a personal connection because when my parents and I came to the United States in 1949 as refugees, we were clients of HIAS who helped us settle in the United States. And HIAS was in the news most recently, as some of you may recall, when they were singled out, named by the gunman, the Pittsburgh synagogue gunman, and targeted as with anti-Semitic vitriol. And then Arjun Singh Sethi, who is from DC. He is a professor at Georgetown. He's a human rights lawyer, a community activist, and the author, most recently, of American Hate, Survivors Speak Out, which we actually will be selling this afternoon. And then finally, I want to introduce my very dear friend, Cecile Lipworth, who is on the board of Art and Remembrance. Cecile lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she and I have done incredible programming together around Esther's work. She also is a feminist activist, a radio host, and a remarkable person, and she will be moderating the panel. So thank you all very much. I'm just very honored and delighted that you're here with us today. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for being here and welcome. I just want to double check, do we need this third microphone for our panelists? No? Okay. We'll just be switching it around. If I'm looking at my phone, it's not because I'm texting anyone, it's just to track time a little bit. But you are all welcome to tweet and Facebook, anything we're saying. We really want this message to get out in the world, so feel free. We won't just switch your ringers off, but please do tweet and Facebook and Instagram. Before we begin, I want to just do something that we do in Santa Fe. Santa Fe, we acknowledge the place that we are at and the land that we're on, which is stolen land. And I want to do that for us here in Baltimore this afternoon. Oh, P.S., my accent is South African, and I go in between South African and Americanisms. So afternoon and afternoon sometimes comes up. But just so you don't worry about who I am. So I do want to just call us in and acknowledge the place and the space that we're on and the land we're on today, which is the land of the Potomac, the Piscataway, the Accokeek, the Choptank, and the Lumbee. And it's really important that we begin to do that all throughout America right now because we are on stolen land. And that is part of the conversation we want to have this afternoon. So I know Bernice's exhibition, her mother's exhibition. We produced it in Santa Fe. And when we were looking at coming here to do the opening and as part of the board coming to do the opening, I really envisioned this conversation we were going to have this afternoon called Beyond the Politics of Hate. And then little did I know that Rebecca's vision and my vision was sort of the same thing, although she's far more brilliant visionary in it. But I think if you haven't seen the exhibition, for those of you who have maybe walked through, the concept of what we want to talk about this afternoon is really what the exhibition is showing us. That hatred and this sort of othering and seeing people as different to us stems from decades and centuries ago, and then also is so current. And genocide and the murder and hatred of other people is not something that's new today. And I think very specifically in America, how it's being brought up right now in this political moment is hugely important for us to have conversations like this, which may be difficult for us, and we may sit in some discomfort in it, and I invite you to sit in the discomfort a little bit, because those are the moments when we really truly learn something. So given that, I do want to go to Judy first, because on Friday night when we were at the opening, Judy mentioned to me, you know, your great-grandfather's family was annihilated, essentially. And just how does that impact, you know, generationally, what goes on and how we are and how we envision and how we perceive of what happened to our indigenous communities here?
I can only speak to how it impacted my family, which also would impact any association they have outside the family. My grandfather was a warrior with the Apache Nation. He was under Cochise. Cochise was our big war chief. There were other chiefs, but he was the one that my grandfather and great-grandfather, and actually great-great-grandfather, because that went back a long time. My grandfather had a family. They talked, well, that's later, but he had a family that lived in the Apache Nation was hunted. The president at the time said that no person in the West will be safe until the Apaches are wiped from the face of the earth. And so our warriors mostly were the ones who hunted and made sure we had the meat that we ate, and of course our women took care of the family. We are a matriarchal, matrilineal group. I'm sorry, I forget things a lot, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time before I do it a lot. The warriors would set up, they had to hide us. I'm saying us because it was my family. They had to hide us. We had to be hidden into the desert, anywhere they could put us, that they would hope that the Mexican soldiers and the government soldiers of America wouldn't find us. And so the families, the elders, the children, and the women were hidden. And they would go and do the hunt so that we could eat, and then they would bring back and it would be taken care of, and they wouldn't have to go hunting again for a week or so. Grandma said that I know when I was little they had to hunt every day, but back in that time there were so many that they could hunt and feed, because we were a small group. I probably no more than 40 or 50 people in one, if you would call village, one encampment. That's what we call it, encampment. There's another word for it, but I can't remember at the moment. So they hid us. They hid the families. They went out to hunt. When they came back, everyone was dead. They had killed, literally slaughtered every human being that was left in that camp, which was just our children and the women and the elders. So, of course, that kind of set off the anger, and the men then went out to kill as many white settlers as they could. You know, I think about this, and I don't get angry because it's far enough away from me. I get upset about it when I think that I didn't know these people. They're part of me, and I don't know them. I will never know them. But it doesn't make me angry. And it also hurts. It made my grandfather extremely angry. He hated with everything in him the white government. they had talked the Apache Nation men into giving up their weapons. There's a song by, what's his name? I listen to him every day. It's called It's a Good Day to Die. And it was, I can't believe I'm having this reaction. They talked our chiefs into giving up the guns. All of our men came in and gave up their guns. And then the spears and anything that they had, because they were promised. And there was 2 of the Indian agents that they trusted, and they were promised that our people would be fed, our people would have blankets, we would have a safe place to be, and there would be no more killing. So it happened. Then what they did was they took every single young man, every man of weapon-carrying age or fighting age, and split them up. And they moved them all over the country. They took us out of our sacred lands, the lands that my people have been on for generations and generations, and moved. My grandfather was part of a small group that got sent to Texas. Most people don't know anything about that. It wasn't in the history books. It's never really talked about. But they had decided that these young men, because he was still a very young man, he died at 107 in 1964. So it tells you he was a young man during this time. And they sent them to Texas. What they were going to do is use them as slaves. These were strong young bucks. They were going to make slaves out of them, and they were helping Texas grow and become more hospitable. The thing they forgot, and my grandfather said it that way, what they forgot was that the Apaches know the desert. They can get away and go and live in the harshest places. And so of course they escaped. When I was born, I was never taken anywhere I would see a white person. I actually had never seen a black person either, and I knew that my great-great-grandmother was an escaped slave. And so we knew, we had that blood in us, but I never saw that there were others out there, other people. So Grandpa didn't want me to know about white people. He didn't want my young aunts to know about white people, mostly because he hated the government so much. When he escaped, he would never, ever go anywhere there was a government agency. We never, I know they gave commodities to the natives. He had a friend in, actually it was my grandmother's friend, in Peoria, Arizona, who would bring us the government commodities so we could add it to our food. But we lived in an encampment at the base of the Bradshaw Mountains. And when I was taken and sent to Indian school, I was never so stunned in my life to see all the colors of the people, because I only know my people.
Just to take that a step further and just to bring it also around, I think the interesting thing to look at is when we were doing the exhibition in Santa Fe, and this comes to you a little bit, Mark, as well. It was such an interesting thing at the time the refugees were starting to come into Europe, which was in 2015-16. And Bernice and I saw the picture on the front page of the paper of the trail of refugees coming into Europe. And if you've seen Bernice's mother's exhibition, she has a picture of the Jews on the trail, which follows that sort of little winding road going to the trains. And then we saw that picture, and then I happened to be looking at my daughter's history book and saw the picture of the Trail of Tears, where it was literally the same picture, all 3 pictures of. So our history is repeating itself, and Mark, perhaps you can talk a little bit about, when HIAS first began, it was for a very specific reason of sheltering refugee Jews into America, but of course now with everything going on, taking it even further into how our refugees currently are flooding into our country and what are we doing with this huge, momentous population that's coming in and how we're treating them given the current political administration.
Yes, HIAS was established in 1881 in response to what was really a genocide at that time. There was no word for genocide until the 1940s, but certainly they had been happening over the centuries, and one of them was at the end of the 19th century when the Tsar had decided that he was going to try to get 1/3 of the Jews to leave the Russian Empire, 1/3 to convert, and he planned to kill 1/3 of them, or at least that was the perception. And there was a massive campaign of pogroms across the Russian Empire and in Eastern Europe, and this led to the biggest mass migration of Jews since the 15th century and the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. And so HIAS was established to respond to this huge mass migration, to be situated in the Lower East Side of New York, first on Castle Garden and then on Ellis Island, to make sure that the Jews who got there were given kosher food while they were waiting, and most importantly, that they got past the immigration authorities and onto some safe destination in the United States. And so, over the last 140 years, HIAS has gone from being an organization that helped refugees because they were Jewish to one that helps refugees because we are Jewish, and now we help refugees of all faiths and ethnicities on behalf of the American Jewish community. The problem is that while we were doing this, American Jews didn't know that we were doing it on their behalf. The refugee issue was not really one that the American Jewish community or other communities, frankly, were paying attention to, even as a global refugee crisis was raging. And then finally, the event that you mentioned in 2015, the photograph of Elam Kurdi, woke up the Jewish community right before the high holidays. It woke up other faith communities. It woke up the Obama White House, frankly, because President Obama had also not been paying much attention to the world refugee crisis. And we thought, finally, the apathy is no longer a problem. The refugee issue will be addressed. And we had a real sense of optimism. It was a dark period because of the massive scale of global displacement and people fleeing persecution in larger numbers than at any time since the Second World War. But at least people were noticing, and the White House was noticing, and something was being done, and people were talking about it. But then something really horrible happened on November the 13th, 2015, just a little more than 2 months later. And that is, there was a terrorist attack in Paris, another terrorist attack in Paris. And that in and by itself was a horrible incident. But what was also horrible was the response in this country, which is 31 governors decided that they were going to proclaim that they would not allow Syrian Muslim refugees into their states. This is something I never thought that I would see in my lifetime, including the governor of Maryland, who's known for being a moderate. 31 governors did not hesitate to say, we do not want to allow Syrian Muslim refugees. Never mind that there was no Syrian Muslim refugees who was even implicated in this attack. But that did not stop them. And 14 Republican presidential candidates at that time all said basically the same thing. So this marked the politicization of the refugee issue in a way that we had not ever seen in our lifetime. This really shocked me. And you can just imagine what the response would have been if the governors had said, we're not going to allow Jews into our states, right? We've developed an immune system against anti-Semitism to react, I think, more quickly when we hear that. But there was not that level of reaction that there should have been, given that governors wanted to ban people based on where they were born or what they believed. And this is what we have been focused on fighting ever since. And as I said, they could have banned Jews, they could have banned Mexicans, they could have banned other groups as well. They chose to pick on Syrian Muslims. But now, sure enough, we see other groups being targeted, including Jews, right? And that's what we have to remind ourselves when we talk about anti-Semitism, the Jewish community. Anti-Semitism is real, but it does not exist in isolation. It always exists surrounded by other forms of hatred. Anti-Semites don't just hate Jews, they tend to hate others as well. And once we see someone else being hated, it's just a matter of time before it will spread to this group, and to that group, and to another group.
Thanks, Mark. I think it's a really important thing to address and to just highlight again that, I did some work in the Congo for a few years ago, and over 12 million people have been killed in the Congo through the war there. And really it's all about minerals, and the minerals we use for our cell phones, the coltan that we use in our cell phones. And so 12 million people have been killed in a war there, and we couldn't get people to pay attention to that because we always see everybody as other, right? And so when we're Jewish, we see it as other problems, I think, my belief. We see everybody as other, and that helps us to keep ourselves insular, but also not to think that other people are going through what we went through. So I think this exhibition, I just want to come back to that, how important it is, because I think that we need to recognize that even though we're focusing on a Holocaust survivor stories, the stories of Holocausts have happened to Native Americans, to the Congolese, to the Rwandans, to the Rohingyas. So I think it's a really important piece that we need to keep emphasizing of how we view that. In the exhibition, Rebecca's done this beautiful thing of statements, love and sort of the politics of hate, really, but of love. And there's one by Theodore Roosevelt that says, "This country will not be a good place for any of us to live unless we make it a good place for all of us to live in." And Arjun, you wrote your book, American Hate, having come out of the 2016 election, going around the country and talking to people about this very thing, right? Like, we're a place where we don't love each other, where we have hatred for one another in our communities, in small communities. Can you tell us a little bit I know you have, please buy the book, there are incredible stories in here, but maybe just draw upon some of them to give us a perspective on that, what you saw after 2016.
Sure. I want to start by thanking my co-panelists, thanking all of you for being here. I know there is a lot of pain, hurt, and trauma in this moment, and it's difficult sometimes to be part of these conversations, so thank you all for being here. Thank you for checking out the exhibit. So I'm a community activist. I work closely with Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, and Sikhs across America. And really what I was hearing in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election was that hate was intensifying across the country, in schools, the workplace, public life. And so really in 2017, I took to the road and I met with people across the country who were directly impacted. People whose synagogues had been vandalized, people whose mosques had been burned to the ground, people whose loved ones had been assaulted, in some cases, people whose loved ones had been murdered. And really what I found in my travels was that, yes, hate is intensifying in every facet of American life. I found that many survivors in this country often don't have the resources they need. Many survivors lack health care. Many survivors have PTSD. I found there were many survivors who truthfully didn't report hate crimes because in many ways we still live in a culture of denial where we are more likely to disbelieve somebody if they make an allegation of hate violence, make an allegation of sexual assault, than we are to believe them. Which is why in my book, it's actually a series of testimonials. So I worked with the survivors. Again, I met with them in their homes, houses of worship, and tape recorded, or I shouldn't say tape recorded because we graduated from that, but I recorded these interviews. They were often 40,000 words, and then with the survivors, transcribed them and edited them into 3,000-word testimonials. And I did that because it's really an archive of this very dark moment. It gave survivors an opportunity to tell their stories in their own words. So some of the folks that you will find in the book, the very first story in the book, and it plays very well with what we've been discussing today, is the story of Asma Abu-Qayyad, the first Syrian refugee to ever be resettled in Boise, Idaho. And she talks in very real detail about how every time Donald Trump or anybody else on the campaign trail would say something ugly about Syrians, and for those of you who don't remember, at one point they were compared to snakes. She would talk about how after that ugly rhetoric, she would get menacing looks in the grocery store. People would say terrifying things to her in the street. She also talked in the book about how one day her young son, Muslim, was walking in downtown Boise when someone came up to him and said, "Are you Muslim?" And when the young boy said yes, he was violently punched to the ground. And what makes the story in part so extraordinary is Asma actually recounts how months later, after the man had been apprehended, she was invited to court by the judge. And the judge asked her what she thought an appropriate sentence in this case would be. And her response wasn't, put this man in jail. And let's be clear, she could have said that, right? I mean, the United States is the most carceral state in modern history, right? To put some sort of color on that. The United States is home to 4% of the world's total population, but houses 25% of the world's total prison population. So Asma could have said, lock him up, but she didn't. She said this person isn't going to learn about Syrians, refugees, or Muslims in jail. He needs to spend time with the community. And really, that was a theme I found throughout my book. I found that so many of the survivors really want, more than anything else, just the opportunity to tell their stories, the opportunity to have difficult conversations, in some cases, even have conversations with those who wish them harm. Just a couple of more stories that you can find in the book. I don't know how many of you remember the terrible tragedy that happened on the MAX train in Portland, Oregon in May 2017. So Destiny Mangum, Walia Muhammad, they were the two young black women who boarded a MAX train in Portland, Oregon, when a white supremacist who was known to police started harassing them, threatening their lives. When three upstanders intervened, and two of them gave their lives protecting those two girls from what very well could have been death. Destiny Mangum and Walia Muhammad tell their story for the first time in the book. You know, one of the other stories that's in the book is the story of Tanya Gersh. And Tanya Gersh's story is relevant for a lot of reasons, because it really goes to show that anyone can be impacted in this political moment at any time. Tanya Gersh is a Jewish-American wedding planner who lives in Whitefish, Montana. To cut a long story short, there was you can call it a misunderstanding, but regardless of sort of the backstory, at some point in time, really just after the 2016 presidential election, Tanya Gersh started to be trolled on account of her Jewish identity by anti-Semites across the country and really the world. And for a period of 4 months, Tanya Gersh received somewhere between 800 to 1,000 menacing emails, Facebook posts, phone calls, voicemails. These white supremacist hate mongers published her children's social media profiles. And actually, Tanya talks about how she had to make the very difficult decision of speaking to her 10-year-old son about the Holocaust. And she recounts in her testimonial how every Jewish parent struggles with when to have that conversation with their children. And how in this case, she felt like she had to speak to her son at the tender age of 10 about anti-Semitism and about why, people had photoshopped her face and her family photo in front of the Auschwitz concentration camp.
Well, I think that also speaks to the stories that black parents have to have with their black sons who are walking on the streets. When is the right time to tell them that, be careful, this is what's happening in our country right now. And I think, Arjun, sort of the storytelling you do in the book and the storytelling that gets done through Esther's artwork is the power of bringing statistics into real life, right? Like through storytelling, through art, through literature, creative art. I think, and Judy, of course, through your art, that's how we tell the true stories of the people who are living it on a day-to-day, because it is so easy for us to other everybody else when you're not having that experience. As a white privileged woman, I don't have that experience. So for me to relate to it is extremely difficult. So I think, I'd love to talk a little bit, Judy, about how you bring your stories to life through your art, and then Mark, perhaps how you're bringing the stories of our current border crisis to light so that we actually understand the reality of what's going on. I live on a border state, so unfortunately I hear a lot about it, but I'd love your perspective. But Judy, I'd love to hear from you.
I do my art, and I have to thank my grandmother for it. We didn't call it art. It was how we lived. But it's medicine. And I've had a lot of people ask me how to explain what I mean by medicine. And I said it's like an energy. It's like how you can make people feel. How you can put something out there that they feel and will make them better or make them think. It's a way of teaching. My grandmother was a medicine woman, but she practiced a different kind of medicine, and I fought against that most of my life. I don't want to be a medicine woman. Too much work, too much everybody else. But she told me, she said, you are a medicine woman, you can't not be one. You may be different, but you are one. So, okay, I don't call myself a medicine woman. Right now, I do medicine. Or at least I try to. And I was in a women's group meeting once, and everybody kept saying they did Reiki. Well, I didn't know what Reiki was. I heard the word, but I didn't know what it was. So I said, okay, what is Reiki? I don't know what this is. Can somebody tell me what this is? And the young woman that had just spoken, she said, Re means universal and Ki is energy. It's universal energy. I went, oh, that's medicine. So I knew it all the time. Grandmother was a medicine woman, and she was really strong, and people from other nations came to her. Medicine is never for sale. If you have somebody who tells you they are a medicine person and they want to charge you money, just be real careful, okay? Be real careful, because it's a gift that you're given and you have to share it. She told me that I was going to teach. I had to teach. There was going to come a time in this country when the worship of rocks and rags and science, and for her, money was rocks and rags. And if you think about it, it really is. She used to say, if I brought you this handful of rags over here, and I told you, I want your car, I like your car, can I have that car? I give you rocks and rags. You would say, look, old lady, go away. And she said, they're going to learn that doesn't feed their spirit or their soul. I believe that the hatred stems from like what's going on right now. It's money. It's rocks and rags, and that's all it is. And yet these people think that they can make it so valuable that you'll do anything they say so they can get more of it. Like the pipeline destroying the land. That's your water too. It's not just us, it's your water too. We all should be the water protectors, So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir now. When I was at the Indian school, one of the nuns taught me that saying and what it meant. It's like when you're talking to people who mostly will agree with you. That's the point. So, but she told me that I was going to have to teach, and I had to do my medicine. And she told me also, never, ever do bad medicine. It will stick to you. And you will never be able to wash it away. Because when it sticks to you, I touch you, it goes to you. And you touch him, and it goes to him. And it grows into this big, awful thing. I think of that cartoon with the little guy that used to have the black cloud with the lightning that followed him around. And that's how I always visualize bad medicine. I don't want that cloud on my head. But, so I make my paintings medicine. The one that's here, the Prayer for Peace, that was because my daughter and I were standing in a living room, and I heard the thing, and that was when the Desert Storm, the wars were, and it was after the, oh gosh, I can't remember anything. Anyhow, the wars were all starting to go, and all of the hatred and the fighting and the people around the world were getting together to create a prayer circle. And you were supposed to take the hand of the person next to you, and you were supposed to keep passing on so that each of us did that prayer. And I said, well, I have my daughter's hand, so we took our hands, but I said, I know how I want to do this. And I saw the picture, and I went in, and I just, because I just stapled a canvas on the wall, and I don't know what's going to happen after that. I do my prayers and hope.
And it's an exquisite piece, Judy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Every dot is a prayer, and I don't know who, I can't tell you, say, oh, that dot is for so-and-so. But somebody will say, will you pray for me? I say, oh yeah. I ask the spirits. I probably drive the spirits crazy, you know? And I tell Creator off all the time. So probably that's why I don't have, I keep being taught the lesson of patience. I haven't got it yet. But, so that's why I do my paintings the way I do. I'm doing medicine. I'm trying to create the energy so that when you go by, and I gave Rebecca a terrible time when the first show, the storyteller show, because for me, someone touching the painting is adding medicine to it and taking some away. Because us touching each other moves that medicine around, so that when you clasp the hand of someone, think a good medicine thing. So that keeps moving that around. I really feel that it can make a big difference. But she told me to always, always, always do good medicine. And even though my family thinks I fuss too much, it's mostly about who put that there. It doesn't go there.
Well, so please, I think everyone should, what she's saying is when you see the exhibition, definitely go up to it and touch. She has hundreds of beads on the exhibition and on her piece of art, and you are welcome to touch it and take the medicine away with you.
Yes, and I am doing I'm working on a piece right now, and it's been, I got kind of cocky and said, yes, I can do it in 2 weeks. It's something that usually takes months. And I do my prayers and I hope, and then it doesn't, and but it's going to be over there later. I promise that, well, I can't promise. But I'm working on trying to get it over there by Tuesday morning.
So I'd love to just move along to Mark
yes,
a little
I'm
bit.
sorry.
No. We
It's
love
a
your art.
blessing.
It's the art of storytelling. We're storytelling. Stories take time to tell. We can't rush them. But unfortunately, we do have a time limit. But thank you. So Mark, I think certainly what's happening on the borders has captured everybody's attention. Unfortunately, it took the displacement and the separation of families for everyone to sort of maybe be impacted. I'm not sure. I live in this town in Santa Fe, which is a little insular. We have a lot of attention on what's going on the border right now. We have an incredible group of lawyers called the Santa Fe Dreamers Project. Please follow them. They're doing unbelievable work in detailing what is really happening in the prisons, because they go into the prisons in Cibolo with the trans women, as well as along the border in Tornillo and Texas. But I know you're doing a lot of work on the borders with the refugees, and of course we've just had this other caravan that's been coming our way, coming into America, or trying, the asylum seekers. How do we get these stories out through organizations like yours, where it's not so artistic, it's really a life it has to be life-saving, really. So how do we get the public to pay attention to this?
Right, well, first, when you first asked this question, you mentioned the border crisis. That's a term we do not use. We have a national crisis right now. We don't have a border crisis.
Yes.
The number of undocumented immigrants crossing the border is actually at record low numbers right now, lower than it's been in decades. The number of people who are crossing though in family units is at a high, interestingly. But there is not a crisis along the border. The border is always a difficult place because, yes, you have undocumented immigrants coming in, you have asylum seekers and refugees coming in, you have drugs coming in. All these things do cross the border, but this has been going on for hundreds of years, and right now it is going on at a lower rate than it has been in many decades again. So it's a manufactured crisis, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is let's scapegoat, let's blame our problems on the other. Let's say that if we build a wall, crime will go down and our lives will get better. And that's simply not the case. We have to wrestle with our issues here in this country without blaming Mexico for the problems that we have. But that being said, because of the policies that are going on now, there are crises that we have to deal with that we didn't have to deal with before, which is separating children from their parents, which is telling asylum seekers they have to wait in Mexico and where they have serious protection issues until we invite them to come in to wage an asylum interview. These are the problems that we're wrestling with. So right now, immediately after this event, I'm actually going to Tucson to do some speaking with some congregations along the border, and also to San Diego, where the Jewish Family Service of San Diego runs a migrant center, where when undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers are released from detention, they are given to the Jewish Family Service of San Diego, and then which houses them until they can move on to other places in the country where they have communities waiting for them and where they can wage an asylum claim. But we really, we have to get their stories out. We have to get people, above all, legal assistance, frankly, because people who are seeking asylum are often detained in places where there is no access to attorneys, and there is very little hope of understanding this very complicated system if you don't have any legal help. And U.S. law actually, while it assures you the right to an attorney, you have to find that attorney yourself and pay for that attorney yourself, and oftentimes you have to do it from inside a detention center where you don't even have access to the internet, where you can't make more than one phone call outside without calling collect. So these are real serious challenges that we have, and so we're trying to take our asylum program at HIAS, which is right now in the Silver Spring, Maryland, where we have our headquarters, in New York, and trying to make this into a national program so that asylum seekers can get legal representation wherever they are. Because your odds of getting asylum increase by a multiple if you have representation.
So, thank you. I think at this moment right now, and sort of just winding it up a little bit, but this moment that we're in right now, it is a huge opportunity. It's a big wake-up call that I don't think, as an immigrant myself, and I grew up in South Africa during apartheid, we were very much judged, rightly so, of course, but we were judged about what we were doing as white South Africans without the introspection of what other cultures had done to their own populations, like in America, what has happened to the Native American culture. And so I see this as a really huge opportunity for us now as we move beyond the politics of hate, as this panel is about. What are the ways we can really have some introspection into who we are, what we're doing, and how we're treating one another? And what are the ways forward that we can manifest to make that a reality?
I just have a question. I would like to ask you, because I get asked this sometimes too, and I really don't know, so I want to know from you. What can the average person do, just the everyday Joe, do to help? What things could we do, like me? What can I do here that I can help? Because I see those children and I see the mothers being taken away, and and I'm from Arizona, I saw it a lot, many years.
Well, and let's not forget the indigenous, our Native American, I know friends whose family, they were taken away from their children and put into boarding school. Taken away, far away. So, I mean, it is about what are the steps to making it right, but it's also about acknowledging a little bit, because when we don't say what it is, our own internal privilege or white supremacy, we don't name it, we actually don't work on it. We just still keep thinking, I'll give my charity and I'll help that happen, or I'll have the conversation, or I'll draw attention to it. But I think there's a lot of personal work that has to go into us moving beyond the politics of hate. I'd love to know.
So there's a lot. So much of my book actually focuses on this exact question. In no particular order, I would start by just saying be kind. Kindness is infectious. Positivity is infectious. And I will also tell you that there are literally survivors in this room. There are survivors of police violence in this room, of sexual assault, of all kinds of violence. And so really be kind, be generous, give a platform to survivors. Again, I found survivors don't want to tell their stories all the time, but many of them want to have that opportunity. So if you are part of a PTA, part of a faith community, part of a church, a synagogue, a workplace that wants to create an opportunity for a survivor, for a refugee to tell their story, give them that opportunity. I think we need to talk about racism, hate, and the like as public health issues. As we've learned from the exhibit, as we've learned from Judy, there is a lot of trauma that's generational. So let's talk about it that way. I think the NIH should be treating racism and hate and studying it as public health issues. You know, one of the other things I think is important is just data. So according to the FBI in 2017, there were roughly 7,200 hate crimes that were committed in the United States. And that's a lot. And it represented I think an 18% spike over the previous year. But the true number of hate crimes in the United States, for example, is actually closer to 250,000. That gap exists because the FBI report relies on voluntary reporting by police. It's not mandatory. So a lot of police departments don't report. Or they want to pretend like hate doesn't exist in their backyard, in the same way they love to pretend that police violence doesn't exist in their backyard. We're in Baltimore, after all, right? And so I think we should make sure, right, that Baltimore and make sure that Maryland and every police department in this state is accurately counting the number of people who are targeted by hate violence. And if everyone does their share, we'd have a better count.
And believe survivors, because I think that is just such an important thing that we keep forgetting. And I think the Me Too movement brought that into our face about, I worked for 20 years in working in the feminist world of ending violence against women and girls. We couldn't get people to believe women's stories, right? The storytelling women were saying, and the same thing, the United Nations statistic is 1 in 3 women will be sexually raped or assaulted in their lifetime. That's only based on reported cases, and we know from the Me Too movement how many people haven't reported their cases. So I agree, it's about believing survivors and talking.
And that is such an important point, right? And the Me Too movement deserves all the credit for helping us shift that paradigm, right? Because the paradigm for so long has been a culture of denial. When a Native person came forward and said, this is what happened to my community, we didn't believe it. When a refugee came forward and said, this is the way I was treated, we didn't believe it. When a black person said, you know what, my grandfather was lynched, we didn't believe it. That's why Brian Stevenson's doing the work he's doing in the South, right? And so we've got to make that shift, right, to one of belief, where we are believing survivors, because when we believe survivors, we create the conditions whereby they can come forward. We change and we shift from a culture of impunity to one of accountability. And honestly, on a macro level, we're also shifting from centering the elite and powerful to the weak and vulnerable, to people who are often targeted by the violence that we're trying to end.
Yes, thank you. As we draw to a close, I have two things I want to end on. The one was, it always happens like this. I was scrolling through my Instagram this morning, went up through my coffee, and a saying came up from the Talmud. And I thought that was really interesting. And it said, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obliged to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And going into that is, on Friday night, Rebecca said some beautiful words when she opened the exhibit, and I'd love for you to take these words into your hearts and walk out of here thinking how you may do one small act of kindness, treat somebody differently than you have thought about something. And she said, when we hate, we are at our worst selves. No, sorry, she said, we human beings are an imperfect lot. When we hate, we are at our worst selves. When we love, we are at our most perfect selves. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to get your book signed by Arjun and Denise. Oh, sorry. If anyone has any questions, I think we'd be happy to take them.
I'm going to do a commercial. You did such a good job with all the panelists. Okay, I got an answer for you, Judy, real quick. Less than a week from now, this coming Saturday, we have our annual gala. And something happened with the addresses, and about a third of them never arrived to anyone. But despite that, we are going to have the most extraordinary answer to your question embodied. There is a man that we're honoring, actually two. One is Joe Jones, who's done, made an art of parenting here, works a lot with incarcerated dads to make them better dads. But we're also honoring Daryl Davis. How many of you have ever heard of him? Daryl Davis is an incredible blues musician who graduated as a kind of a prodigy out of Howard and joined a country band. And when he was up in Frederick as part of an all otherwise white band, a man jumped on stage and said, "Oh my gosh, I loved your music. How did you as a black man ever learn to play like Jerry Lee Lewis?" And Daryl said, "Well, I've known Jerry Lee Lewis since I was 13, and he got it from us." And the man said, "Oh, I never heard that. I never heard that." And then the next night, the guy so loved this music, he came back. And this time he stuck out his hand, and he said, "You know, I've never shaken the hand of a black man before, but I love your music." And, you know, Daryl, very sophisticated guy, thought that was strange. He said, "Well, I don't drink. I'll have a cranberry juice, but I'll buy you and your friend a drink." So the guy sits down, and he starts, you know, to drink. And he starts being loose of lip, and he says to Daryl, he says, "You know, you're really a great guy. I love your music. You're obviously a really nice person. But you know, all black people have a latent gene to be rapists, murderers, and thieves." And Daryl collected himself and just said, "Well, you know, all white people have a latent gene to be serial killers. And he named like this, the top 12 serial crimes have always been done by white people. And he didn't believe that, but he showed the jitsu, right, of what thinking can do to make any case, or not thinking. And so over the next 30 years, Daryl Davis has made it part of his life's mission to listen to and befriend over 200 KKK members who gave up their membership in KKK. By the way, I forgot to tell you that the guy let it out that he was a card-carrying member of the KKK, that was the first who gave that up. But over 200 Klansmen forever left the Klan. And Maryland is an epicenter of the Klan, if you know anything about Elkton, you know. So the Grand Wizard of Maryland ended up loving Daryl and learning so much from his patience of wanting to say, how could you hate me? You never even met me. You know, just because of my color. He with that steadfast love. And he is now the godfather to the former Grand Wizard of Maryland. So love is a powerful thing, you know, and this show really talks about how much more courage it takes to stop hate speech. If you're in school, you see somebody being bullied, it starts with, in a loving way, not tolerating that anybody be diminished. And I hope that's what people will take from this exhibition and today's being all together.
So we'd be happy to take a couple of questions, I think, from anyone in the audience, if you'd like to.
Hi, just wondering, I've been hearing a lot about asylum seekers, and I figure the purpose is to better their lives, but can someone say the specifics of their living conditions or what may push someone as an asylum seeker?
Did you hear that?
Sure. So that's a good question. So an asylum seeker is someone who is trying to find refuge, and they are fleeing their country of origin based on persecution because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their social group, or their political opinion. So their life or their freedom is in danger because of any one of those 5 grounds. And an asylum seeker is somebody who is claiming asylum, and then if the government agrees that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, they are allowed to get asylum and remain in this country. In the United States, a refugee is somebody who is also an asylum seeker, but they make their claim overseas, and the United States government may choose to interview them and then bring them over here through kind of an orderly process. And there's no difference between an asylum seeker who becomes an asylee or a refugee other than where they apply. The one difference, though, is that if you come to this country, you have a right to seek asylum. The United States has to give you asylum. Any country has to give you asylum if you need it. They cannot turn you back to a place where you would be persecuted because of who you are or what you believe. However, if you're in a foreign country and you apply to the United States for refugee status, the United States does not have to take you even if you meet that standard. But once you get to the border of the United States or inside of the United States, then you have an absolute right to claim asylum. And this came out of the Second World War. Up until 1948, there was no right to seek asylum. There was no right to asylum. And this is why 6 million Jews were trapped inside of a Holocaust, inside of a genocide. They could not escape. And so to make sure that never happened again, the international community, after the war, established through the Refugee Convention of 1951 a right to seek and enjoy asylum.
And I just want to add to that, again, just a point of perhaps looking deeper into why we have so many people fleeing Central and South America. oftentimes policy of the United States has caused war in those countries, and they're fleeing to America to seek asylum from policies that have created the havoc in their countries in the first place. Please read up on that, it's very important. Anyone else? Bruce?
In all this discussion, it took me back to my childhood, 2nd grade, and they showed us these product maps of the world, and what was made in America, what was made in Europe, what was being made in Asia and Africa, and it just opened my mind. I was 7, 8 years old at that time. How can there be so much difference in the world in per capita income? How can we have such an enormous level of income inequality? It just felt to me wrong. But it also felt to me like this will not stay this way because the world is getting smaller. And now we have people throughout the world. How many billion cell phones are there in the world where people can see what it's like here in America or in Europe? And when people see that and they're living in dire poverty, it creates the urge for migration. But we also have it here in this country too. And this is certainly what I saw happening in Germany in the 1930s. It was an impoverished nation. And yet the Germans could look out and see how the economy was going in France and England. And this is what causes war. This is what causes prejudice in local communities. Seeing other people who have things that you don't have and you don't have the opportunity to get there.
Thank you.
So perhaps the speakers would comment on what we can do to reduce this, to make us all feel like we are one people. In elementary school, we learned, "My country 'tis of thee." And now I realized it was 5 years or 10 years after that Woody Guthrie said, "This land is our land, this land is your land." We are together. This is all ours, and if we try and say, "This is mine, and none of you can have it," we are doomed.
Capitalism. Yeah.
Thanks for a great panel, well moderated. This is less of a question and more of a comment. 2 other things that we can do are to give and to vote. And I think that most people are inherently good, and that if your voice is heard, government becomes reflective of that goodness, and when it's not reflective. So, in answer to your question, what other people can do, that's something to think about.
Yes, we have now 137 women in office. Yes. That is reflective of our government and how change happens. And that did take grassroots people going out and knocking on doors and doing phone banking to get those women elected so that we could see our own representation in the government. Anybody else?
So a lot of these talks, as was mentioned, is preaching to the choir, but the people that really need to hear these messages and engage in this conversation are those that don't attend events like these and actively don't want to attend events like these. So how do we engage those people and start those conversations?
So that's a great question. A couple of observations. One, even if we are preaching to the choir today, that's still important, right? Because it's important for us to have spaces where we can heal, talk, and even just refine our understanding of these issues. In terms of how to reach people who hate or who have this vitriol, in some ways I think it's partly a question of privilege. I can tell you that I've had events in connection with my book tour where I've had to have armed security in the back, right? Because there were threats just based on who I am and the work I do and how I look. And so if you are somebody who can gain admission into some of these spaces by virtue of your privilege, use that privilege, right? So if you are a white person who, as I was talking about earlier, who has that privilege, use it. Because I can tell you, there are folks like me and who just don't sort of have that access. But to kind of put a wrench in all of it, it is hard work. And I will tell you, there was a community organization that did a survey a couple years ago. And basically they asked, a large number of Americans, do you believe that people should be able to worship freely in the United States? And everyone said yes. Do you believe people should be judged on the basis of where they worship or how they worship? And everyone said no. That's protected under the First Amendment. You leave them alone. And then they had, 7 or 8 questions that were red herrings. And then question 10 was, do you think we should have police patrols in neighborhoods with mosques? Yes. Right? So they had just said in question 1 and 2, don't profile people on the basis of faith. And then question 10, they said profile Muslims. And so what I think we need to do is actually break a lot of that down. Right? Because I do think, as the gentleman here pointed out, I do think there are a lot of people who are good, right? I mean, I do think that these impulses can be awakened, and I think that's a lot of what happened in this moment, right? This country was built on a hate crime, the genocide of Native communities, furthered on additional hate crimes, including slavery, Jim Crow, and because we haven't done that work, we haven't done the historical reckoning, that's why these forces can really be mobilized, emboldened, and in some ways even liberated so quickly, because a lot of people have these values. But I do think it starts with basic common principles, and I do think lots of people can rally around, principles of the First Amendment, principles in the Bill of Rights, and then working through it sort of from there. I will also say, a gentleman, mentioned schools. I think we also got to focus on young people, right? Because a lot of people who've conceptualized hate, they conceptualize it in sort of the following way. It's like a pyramid. It starts often with bullying, right? Then, actually it starts with exclusion, right? Then it goes to bullying, right? Then it goes to violence. Then it goes to death. Then it goes to genocide. And that's actually how it happens. And so we've got to make these interventions fast and earlier.
And to add to what Arjun just said, the thing that Art and Remembrance is doing, which is not just because I'm on the board, but I think it's a brilliant thing, is because Esther's story, as Billy said, was something that was just for her and her sister to view at their houses. But they've taken that and put it on display, like at the museum. But in addition to that, we're working now towards building a curriculum that's going to go into the school systems, that will start teaching, that will use Esther's art piece by piece to draw into social studies and geography and timelines and math, all the ways we can really talk about the politics of hate that are going on, whether it's around anti-Semitism, LGBTQ rights, anti-Muslim rhetoric. And I think it's really important, even your question, how do we take that? As a Jewish person, I have to take that into my family too, where we are a liberal family, but still the tradition, the generations of hate against Muslims, against Arabs is deep in my family. And so I have to take that into there first before I can take it out into the world. And it's extremely, extremely painful, extremely difficult, and often something I don't really want to do. So I think it's very important that we start at home or within our circles. Even though we're the choir, we always have some, there is no such thing that no one is racist. I read that. I think we'll do there's one last question at the back. I'm sorry. Unless everyone has time.
Or you could just do all 3 of them at once. And then
Okay. Yeah, let's ask all 3 questions and then we'll answer them as best we can.
Hi. I was hoping to get some insight on what the line between accountability and love is.
love. The line between accountability and love.
I wanted to acknowledge, first of all, Rebecca Hoffberger for her work as a visionary. The whole theme of this museum is really, I hope, becomes more and more viral, just again by us rubbing shoulders in these type of spaces and bringing the conversation on. But I also want to acknowledge one thing. We can talk about politics and faith, and art is one thing that supersedes culture and individuality and so forth. taking our individuality into making it more communal. I think there's a vehicle in art that is very, very untapped, and Rebecca has had the wisdom and the perception and the foresight to materialize that, to democratize these conversations so that people in underserved areas have as equal a voice as those in high places. So what I was going to say as well, in bringing it into curriculums in school and so forth, and also having this museum be kind of a cultural hub, almost an embassy of sorts, to take that and maybe to take that, almost make it these unconventional places, to create embassy hubs and see if there's a way to network and connect those types of hubs, because now with the assets of social media, we can be digitally connected and collective with our voices, and making our voices even louder than people in brick and mortar places. So I just throw that out there. I don't know where your minds are well able to take that and make sense of it, but I just wanted to throw that out as this isn't the end all. We don't just take this and then individually fizzle out, because it will, that just by human nature, a lot of us will go and we'll go on with our ordinary lives, and this will just become a nice moment. I'd like to see there perhaps be some way to connect the dots. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mine is more of a comment and a question. The gentleman asked, how can we deal with these issues? It begins with each and every one of us as individuals. It hits home. Yesterday I had a conversation with a far-right Republican. We both at the end of the conversation realized it was the very first time we had talked to somebody on an opposing view without judging, with understanding, willingness to listen. If every single one of us, when someone makes a comment or someone we made, stops and says, let's discuss this, let's talk about it, we can make a difference. It doesn't need to be a whole group. Just stand up for what you believe, but don't judge. Be willing to listen. Thank you.
Hi, my name is actually a question. I wanted to ask Judy specifically. You mentioned during your awesome talk that you didn't call it art, that you called it medicine. And I wanted to know, what does it mean to you now to be bringing indigenous traditions to a wider audience, and in the context of something like an art museum, where perhaps it hasn't been seen before, or it hasn't been acknowledged as art in that way?
I think I learned to call it art only because it's what everybody else calls it. It's still not art for me, it's still medicine. And everything I do is still medicine. I just have a chance now for more people to touch it and it to gain medicine for more people. And so and I'm actually getting to teach. I teach other people how to do medicine. I just got the most amazing thing. I taught a workshop in France, in south of France, to mostly everybody was from Great Britain or Germany, but I still got to teach this. And I got to paint in a museum, thanks to Rebecca, at the Visionary Museum in Paris, the Haus Saint-Pierre. And I got to meet people from all over the world and talk about medicine and talk about how to pass that on. So for me, it's still medicine. It always will be. And so, and I'm also trying to teach because I'm old now. I plan to live to 107 like my grandfather, but the more I can teach, the happier I am.
So a lot of questions were asked, first by Judy and then by others, and some people have already answered those questions. What can I do? What can we do? And in terms of the sphere that I operate in, which is protecting refugees and asylum seekers, The most important thing was the answer that was just given, really. And this is something that we said repeatedly after the massacre in Pittsburgh happened, which is the most important thing you can do is talk to people that you don't normally talk to. Bruce talked about the internet, and 20 years ago I had real hope that the internet was going to bring us together, but it's definitely done the opposite. It has created echo chambers. Cable TV has created echo chambers that we all live in. We don't listen to one another anymore. And now every time we have an opportunity to listen to somebody who does not share our opinion, we need to have that discussion and understand where one another is coming from. And that's where everything starts. And that's the most important thing, because hateful speech usually starts out just as fear, and then it goes into hate speech, and then it goes into hateful acts, and then it goes into something far, far worse. And we've seen this happen in country after country, and now we see it happening in our own country. And so we have to stop it at its roots, and that is by trying to have conversations with one another, again, with people who don't agree with us. Beyond that, HIAS has had a lot of interest with people wanting to welcome refugees being resettled to this country, but they're not being allowed in right now. The number of refugees resettled to the United States last year was 22,491. That is the lowest number in the history of the resettlement program, which was signed by President Carter in 1980. And yet the numbers of refugees who need resettlement are greater than ever. So rather than getting frustrated because you can't welcome a refugee because they're not coming, there are other things you can do besides dialogue, which is the most important. You can educate others about the issue. You can advocate, very important, with your elected representatives. Even though Maryland is blessed to have representatives who are very welcoming and pro-refugee, they need to prioritize this issue, and they need to hear from us that they should be prioritizing this issue, that we want to make America a welcoming country again. So it's very important that they hear from you. Donating to organizations that help refugees and asylum seekers is important. Voting is certainly important, and voting on these issues is important, and expressing that when you're voting is important. And then volunteering. Asylum seekers, as I said, have tremendous needs. There are many asylum seekers in the state of Maryland. There are lots of organizations that can help them. You can get in touch with HIAS, look at our information on the web, but also with Catholic Charities, the International Rescue Committee. There are many organizations that operate in Maryland that help asylum seekers, and they really do need assistance because they don't get any until after they actually get asylum. It's a very difficult path to go down. So there's lots that you can do.
Really quickly on the question about love and accountability, I think it's really hard, and I think in many ways it implicates issues of transitional justice, which are amongst the hardest issues that we can struggle with. What do you do in a post-conflict society? And I would say the United States is a post-conflict society, to be clear, given our history of racism, genocide, etc. We obviously have the South African example. We have other examples. I think the most important principle is centering survivors and their needs, but I will give you very quickly two very different approaches that draw upon recent American history. In 2012, a white supremacist stormed a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, murdering 6 Sikh worshipers. The very next day, the Sikh community gathered, and they recited their holy prayer, the Ardas. And when they recited the prayer, they prayed for the souls of 7 people, the 6 Sikhs who were murdered, and the soul of the shooter. And the media was speechless, because they hadn't seen anything like it. Juxtapose that to a few years later with the Boston Marathon bombing. And some of you might remember, they couldn't get a funeral home to bury the elder brother who was responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing because he was considered a terrorist, right? So it just gives you very different examples for how people want to approach issues of pain, genocide, call it domestic terrorism. And those are 2 very different examples of how people approach, tragedy.
Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. We really appreciate it.